It began like any other Friday morning in May. The farmers were already in their fields by the time the sun had climbed above the tree line. Women were stoking fires in stone hearths, bread was rising, children were being sent to fetch water from the wells. Across the small towns and scattered homesteads of New England, the 19th of May, 1780, had started quietly, ordinarily, in the way that most days in that hard and rugged part of the world tended to start, with work, with routine, with the steady rhythm of survival. Nobody woke up that morning expecting anything unusual. Nobody looked up at the pale spring sky and felt afraid. Nobody whispered prayers or clutched their Bibles to their chests. Not yet, not in those first gentle hours of the morning when everything still looked the way it was supposed to look, when the world still made sense. But something was coming. Something that no almanac had predicted, that no minister had warned about from his pulpit, that no farmer had felt in his bones the night before. Something that would, within the space of a few hours, transform an ordinary spring day into one of the most terrifying experiences in the history of colonial America. Something that would send grown men to their knees, drive women weeping into their homes, cause animals to behave as though the laws of nature had suddenly been suspended, and convince thousands of people, intelligent, God-fearing, rational people, that the world was ending. The sky was about to go dark, in the middle of the day, and nobody knew why. Think about what that means for a moment. Really think about it. You are a farmer in rural Connecticut or Massachusetts or New Hampshire in the year 1780. You have no television, no radio, no internet, no telephone. Your understanding of the natural world is shaped by the Bible, by folk wisdom, by the observations of your community, by whatever your father taught you and his father taught him. You know how the world works because you have watched it work your entire life, season after season, year after year. The sun rises in the east, it climbs through the morning sky, it reaches its peak at noon, it descends through the afternoon and sets in the west. This is the order of things. This has always been the order of things. It is, in the most fundamental and unshakable sense, the foundation upon which every single day of your life has been built. And then, one day, without warning, without explanation, the sun stops doing what it is supposed to do. The darkness did not arrive all at once. That would have been terrifying enough, but it was the gradual nature of it, the slow, creeping wrongness of it, that made what happened on May 19, 1780, so deeply, viscerally frightening. It began in the early morning hours, before most people had even noticed anything unusual. Those who were awake and outside in the pre-dawn darkness might have remarked that the sky looked strange that night, that the stars seemed dimmer than usual, that there was a quality to the darkness that felt different, heavier, somehow more complete. But that was easily dismissed. Clouds, perhaps, whether coming in from the west, nothing to worry about. By mid-morning, though, something was clearly wrong. The light had been changing for hours, shifting, dimming, taking on colors that light was not supposed to take. Witnesses across New England would later describe the morning sky in terms that sound almost poetic, almost beautiful if you forget for a moment how frightened they were. The light turned yellow, then it turned green. Not the green of trees or grass, but a sickly, unnatural green, the kind of green that makes your stomach turn, the kind of green you see in the sky before a particularly violent storm. Then it turned copper. Then it turned the deep, burnished orange of a sunset, except it was not sunset, it was not anywhere near sunset. It was the middle of the morning, and the sky looked like the end of the day, and nobody could explain why. Animals noticed before people did. That is always the way, isn't it? The roosters had crowed at their usual hour, but then as the morning light began to fail, they crowed again, confused, insistent, unable to understand why darkness was returning when it was supposed to be retreating. Cows that had been put out to pasture began moving back toward their barns, driven by some ancient instinct that told them night was falling and it was time to shelter. Birds that had been singing in the trees fell silent. Frogs began to call from their ponds, the nighttime chorus striking up in the middle of the morning, filling the air with sound that belonged to darkness. Dogs pressed themselves against the sides of houses, whimpering. Chickens went back to their roosts. The natural world, the world that was supposed to make sense, was behaving as though it had lost its mind. And then around midday the darkness came. Not gradually anymore, not the slow dimming of a cloudy afternoon or the orange fade of a smoky sunset. This was something else entirely. This was darkness falling like a curtain, swift and total and absolute. Witnesses said that candles were needed in homes by 11 in the morning. By noon in many parts of New England you could not see your hand in front of your face outdoors without a lantern. The birds stopped singing, the frogs fell silent, the crickets began to chirp. The fireflies, those small ambassadors of summer nights, began to glow in gardens and meadows in the middle of the day, their cold green lights blinking on and off in what should have been bright sunshine. And the people lost their minds. Not metaphorically, not in the polite, measured way that historians sometimes use to describe panic. Actually, viscerally, completely lost their minds, in the way that human beings lose their minds when they encounter something that their entire understanding of reality tells them cannot be happening. Because you have to understand the context here. You have to understand who these people were and what they believed, and what this darkness meant to them in the deepest possible sense. These were not people who would have reached for a scientific explanation. The science did not exist yet, not in the form we know it today, not in a form that could have been immediately and comfortingly deployed to explain away what was happening. These were people for whom the relationship between the natural world and the divine was direct, immediate, and constant. When something went wrong with the natural world, when there was a drought or a plague or an earthquake, it meant something. It was a message. It was God speaking in the language of nature, and what he was saying was never comfortable or pleasant. The natural world did not simply malfunction. The natural world did what God told it to do. And if the sky was going dark in the middle of the day on the 19th of May, 1780, then God had made it so. And the question that immediately, terrifyingly presented itself was, why? The answer that thousands of people arrived at simultaneously, independently in towns and farms and villages across New England was the answer that their entire religious and cultural framework had prepared them to reach. This was the end. The day of judgment had come. The darkness described in the book of Revelation, the cosmic blackout that would precede the return of Christ and the final reckoning of all human souls, was here, it was now, it was happening. And there was nothing to be done except to fall to your knees and beg for mercy and hope that whatever you had done with your life on this earth had been enough. Churches filled within minutes. Men who had not prayed in years dropped to their knees in their fields. Women gathered their children and held them, weeping and praying, not knowing what else to do. In some towns, church bells were rung, the same bells that would ring to warn of fire or Indian attack, because what else do you do when the sky goes dark at noon? You ring the bells, you call the community together, you do not face the apocalypse alone. There are accounts from this day that are almost unbearable to read, not because they are melodramatic or exaggerated, but because they are so human, so nakedly human, in the way that they capture what it feels like to believe, truly believe with every fiber of your being that you are about to die. Mothers who had been at odds with their daughters made their peace. Old men called for neighbors they had feuded with for years and offered forgiveness, wanting to meet God with a clean conscience. Debts were forgiven. Old grievances were set aside. People who had been too proud or too stubborn or too wrapped up in the petty dramas of daily life to tell the people they loved that they loved them, those people, in the darkness of May 19, 1780, finally said the words. And some people did not react with piety. Some reacted with something rawer and less organized, with pure animal terror, the kind that bypasses thought entirely and goes straight to the body. People ran, people hid, people screamed in the streets. There were those who, convinced that the end was imminent, made decisions that were less than noble. There are accounts, though they are difficult to verify, of people drinking heavily, of old sins being revisited rather than repented, of a kind of desperate, nihilistic abandon that sometimes takes hold of people when they believe they have nothing left to lose. This is what darkness does to human beings. This is what it has always done. We are creatures of the light, literally and psychologically, and when the light fails, when it fails in a way that cannot be explained or predicted or controlled, something very ancient and very frightened wakes up inside us, something that remembers a time when darkness meant death, meant predators, meant the cold and the void and the end of things. May 19, 1780, reached into that ancient place and shook it hard, and the result was one of the most remarkable mass psychological events in American history. Now let's talk about what was actually happening. Because here is the thing about the dark day of 1780, it was not supernatural, it was not the end of the world, it was not God sending a message or the fulfillment of biblical prophecy. It was something far more interesting in its way, a perfect, terrible collision of natural phenomena. A reminder that nature, entirely without divine intervention, is capable of producing events so strange and so extreme that the human mind, confronted with them, simply reaches for the most dramatic explanation available. The most widely accepted explanation for the dark day, and the one that has been most thoroughly supported by modern scientific analysis, involves a combination of smoke and fog. Enormous wildfires, and we mean enormous, the kind of fires that modern people might compare to the great western fires of our own era, fires that burn millions of acres and fill the sky with smoke for weeks, had been raging in the forests to the north and west of New England. This was not unusual for the time of year. Spring and early summer often brought fire to the forests, particularly in years when the winter had been dry. But 1780 was different. The fires that spring were extraordinary in their scale and their intensity, burning through vast stretches of forest in what is now Ontario and Upper New England, sending plumes of smoke into the upper atmosphere that spread and thickened over the course of days and weeks. Researchers who have studied this event in detail, and it has attracted serious scientific attention, particularly from climate historians and dendrochronologists who can trace fire history through tree rings, believe that the smoke from these fires created a thick, opaque layer in the atmosphere above New England on May 19th. But smoke alone, even a great deal of smoke, does not usually produce the total, lamp-requiring darkness that witnesses described. For that degree of darkness, you need something more. You need the smoke to be combined with other atmospheric conditions, heavy cloud cover, unusual humidity, specific wind patterns that would prevent any sunlight from penetrating to the surface below. And on May 19, 1780, all of those conditions came together at once. The smoke was there, thick and heavy from weeks of fires. The clouds were there, rolling in from the south and west, low and dense. The atmospheric conditions were exactly wrong or exactly right, depending on your perspective. And the result was a darkness so complete, so absolute, that in the middle of the day in New England, you could not read a page of print without holding a candle to it. There are contemporary descriptions of the quality of this darkness that are genuinely fascinating from a scientific perspective. Several witnesses noted that the little light that did filter through had a peculiar quality, that it cast no shadows or cast shadows that seemed wrong somehow in the wrong direction or the wrong color. Others noted that the darkness was not uniform, that there were gradations to it, patches of slightly lesser darkness surrounded by deeper black, suggesting that the cloud and smoke cover above was not perfectly consistent but had variations in its thickness. The smell was also remarkable. Several witnesses noted that the air during the dark day had a particular smell, a smoky, slightly sulfurous quality that some described as reminiscent of rain-soaked earth and burning wood. This is entirely consistent with what we now know about the event. The air was, in fact, full of particulate matter from the distant fires, microscopic particles of ash and char that had been carried hundreds of miles on the upper-level winds and were now filtering down through the dense cloud cover. Some witnesses also noted that the rain that fell that night and the following morning, because it did rain eventually, the atmospheric conditions that had produced the darkness also producing a heavy rainfall was dark. Not just darker than usual but visibly brown or black, leaving residue on surfaces where it collected. This was the accumulated smoke and ash washing out of the atmosphere, a phenomenon that anyone who has lived downwind of a major wildfire will recognize immediately, though in 1780 it must have seemed like yet another sign that the world had gone fundamentally wrong. But here is the most remarkable part of the story. Here is the part that, if you are the kind of person who finds human beings endlessly fascinating, will stay with you long after you have forgotten the scientific details of the dark day itself. There was a legislative session underway in Hartford, Connecticut, on May 19, 1780. The Connecticut General Assembly was in session when the darkness began to fall. And as the darkness deepened, as the candles were lit in the middle of the afternoon and the light outside the windows failed completely, panic began to spread even among the legislators. These were educated men, men of property and standing, men who prided themselves on their rationality and their capacity for clear-headed governance. And even they were not immune to what the darkness was doing to the human animal. A motion was made to adjourn the assembly. The argument was straightforward and in its way entirely understandable. If this was indeed the day of judgment, they ought not to be found conducting legislative business when Christ returned. They ought to be at prayer. They ought to be with their families. They ought to be doing anything other than arguing about taxation and property rights at the end of the world. The motion gained support. Men were preparing to leave. The session appeared to be on the verge of dissolving into the general panic that was consuming the rest of New England. And then a man named Abraham Davenport stood up. Abraham Davenport was a counselor from Stamford, Connecticut. He was 60 years old in 1780, a veteran of the French and Indian War, a former judge, a man who had spent his adult life in public service. He was not, by any account, a particularly poetic or dramatic man. He was a practical man, a serious man, a man whose defining characteristic seems to have been a calm, stubborn, unshakable commitment to doing what needed to be done regardless of what the circumstances around him suggested about the wisdom of doing it. He stood up in that darkening chamber with the candles guttering and the men around him preparing to flee, and he said something that has been quoted and referenced and celebrated ever since, something that cuts through the noise of 2.5 centuries and lands with a force that is still, somehow, completely intact. He said, and these are roughly his words, reconstructed from contemporary accounts, that he was against adjournment. He said that if it was not the end of the world, there was no reason to adjourn, and if it was the end of the world, he would choose to be found doing his duty rather than trembling in his boots, and therefore he moved that candles be brought in so that they might continue their work. Candles were brought in. The session continued. I want you to sit with that for a moment, because I think it is one of the most genuinely extraordinary things that any human being has ever done. Not extraordinary in the way that battlefield heroism is extraordinary, not extraordinary in the way that great art or great science is extraordinary, but extraordinary in the deepest and most essential human sense, the sense in which a person, confronted with their absolute worst fear, with the possibility that everything they have ever known is about to end, simply decides to keep doing their job. Simply decides that panic is not an option, that the work matters, that if the world is going to end, it might as well end with them in the middle of doing something useful. It is the kind of response to catastrophe that we admire in principle and almost never manage in practice. And Davenport managed it in the literal darkness of what he genuinely believed might be the day of judgment, which makes it, by any reasonable measure, one of the most extraordinary acts of everyday courage in the history of the American Republic. The poet John Greenleaf Whittier was so struck by this story that he immortalized Davenport in a poem called Abraham Davenport, written in 1866, nearly a century after the event. Whittier's poem is worth reading in full if you ever get the chance. It captures something true and important about the man and the moment, the stubborn insistence on normalcy in the face of the abnormal, the refusal to let fear determine behavior, the quiet heroism of simply carrying on. But let's return to the day itself, because there is more to tell. As the afternoon wore on, the darkness began to lift, slowly, unevenly, the way it had descended, patches of slightly lighter sky appearing and then disappearing again as the cloud and smoke cover shifted in the wind. By evening, a dull red light had returned to the sky, not the warm gold of a normal New England sunset but something angrier, more unsettling, the color of dying embers or old blood. The moon rose that night, and witnesses described it as appearing red, blood red, in the language of the apocalyptic tradition, the red moon of Revelation come at last to confirm what the darkness had suggested. For those who had spent the day convinced that they were watching the end of the world unfold, the return of some form of light was not entirely reassuring. The darkness had come once. What was to prevent it from coming again? And that red moon, that was not a comforting sight. That was not the moon of ordinary nights. That was something else, something that fit far too neatly into the framework of prophecy and doom that had shaped their understanding of what was happening. It was not until the following day, when the full light of morning returned and the sky was blue and the sun was once again exactly where it was supposed to be, that the terror began to truly recede. And even then, it did not recede entirely, because something had happened on May 19th that you do not simply recover from overnight. Something had been revealed about the fragility of the natural world, about the thinness of the boundary between the normal and the catastrophic, about what human beings are like when the bottom falls out of their reality. You cannot unsee that, you cannot unlearn it. The aftermath of the dark day was, in many ways, as interesting as the event itself. Ministers across New England seized on it immediately as a teaching opportunity, which is to say, as a fund of terror with which to motivate their congregations toward greater piety and more regular church attendance. Sermons preached in the weeks following May 19th were, by all accounts, fire and brimstone affairs of the highest order, performances of theological drama in which the darkness was deployed as evidence of God's power and human vulnerability, and the urgent necessity of getting right with the Lord before the next opportunity presented itself. Whether this actually produced lasting increases in religious observance is hard to say. The historical record suggests that, as with most such events, the impact on everyday behavior was significant in the short term and less significant over time. People are remarkably good at normalizing even the most abnormal experiences, at finding ways to fit extraordinary events back into the ordinary framework of their lives once the immediate crisis has passed. Within weeks, the fields were being worked again, the debates about taxation and property were resuming, the petty dramas of community life were reasserting themselves. The dark day became a reference point. People would date things as having happened before or after the dark day, the way we might date things before or after a major storm or a notable election. But it did not ultimately transform New England society in any permanent or dramatic way. Which is itself a remarkable thing when you think about it, remarkable and very human. The capacity of people to experience something genuinely apocalyptic, something that, by every available measure, felt like the end of the world, and then, within a matter of weeks, to simply get on with things. To plant the crops and go to market and argue with the neighbors and fall in love and have children and make the same mistakes and harbor the same grudges and do all the countless ordinary things that constitute a life. But here is what did not entirely go away. Here is what persisted and what continues to persist in the historical memory of May 19, 1780. The question, not the scientific question, that one has been answered more or less to the satisfaction of most people who have studied the event. The fires, the smoke, the clouds, the particular combination of atmospheric conditions that turned noon into midnight over New England. That question has an answer, even if the answer has taken 2 centuries and a great deal of scientific work to fully articulate. No, the question that persists is a different kind of question, a more uncomfortable kind, the kind that does not have a clean or satisfying answer. The question is this: what do we do when the sky goes dark? Not the literal sky, though that too obviously, but the metaphorical sky. The sky of our assumptions, our certainties, our settled understanding of how the world works and what we can rely on and what the future is going to look like. What do we do when that sky goes dark? When the thing that was supposed to be there, the light, the order, the predictability, the sense that the world is operating according to rules we understand, simply isn't there anymore. The people of New England in 1780 gave different answers to that question. Some prayed, some panicked, some drank, some did terrible things driven by the conviction that the normal rules no longer applied, some gathered with the people they loved and held them and waited. And one man, one 60-year-old counselor from Stamford, Connecticut, asked for candles and kept working. The history of human civilization is in many ways the history of people learning to ask for candles when the sky goes dark, learning to distinguish between the darkness that is really the end and the darkness that is just a very bad day, learning to sit with the terror and the uncertainty and the not knowing, and to carry on regardless, because the alternative, to let the darkness decide what you do, to let the fear determine the shape of your life, is ultimately no way to live. The Great New England Dark Day lasted roughly 12 hours, from the early morning dimming to the gradual return of light in the late evening. 12 hours in which thousands of people confronted what they believed to be the end of everything, and responded in every way that human beings are capable of responding, with faith and with terror, with nobility and with weakness, with prayer and with panic, and with the stubborn, unglamorous, utterly magnificent decision to light a candle and keep doing the work. The world did not end on May 19, 1780. Obviously, you know that, and the people of New England eventually figured it out too, though it took them a night of blood-red moon and dark rain and desperate prayer to get there. The crops were eventually harvested. The assembly eventually adjourned. The fires that had caused the darkness burned themselves out, as fires always do eventually. But the day did not disappear from memory. It could not, because it had done something to the people who lived through it that could not be entirely undone. It had shown them something about themselves, about the thinness of the line between order and chaos, between the world that makes sense and the world that does not, between the person you think you are in the ordinary light of an ordinary day and the person you actually are when the darkness falls. The Great New England Dark Day remains, more than 2 centuries later, one of the most documented and carefully studied weather events in American history. Scientists still write papers about it. Historians still argue about the precise combination of factors that produce the darkness. Climate researchers use it as a data point in their reconstruction of past atmospheric and fire conditions. And every so often, someone reads about it for the first time and feels that same cold shiver that the people of New England felt on May 19, 1780. The shiver of recognition, the understanding that the world is capable of doing things that our minds are not prepared to process, that there are moments when reality itself seems to have broken down, and that in those moments the only question that really matters is, what are you going to do? Are you going to run? Are you going to pray? Are you going to fold? Are you going to let the darkness have you? Or are you going to ask for candles? That is the question that Abraham Davenport answered on a dark afternoon in Hartford, Connecticut in the year 1780. And it is, in the end, the question that the dark day asks of all of us across the distance of centuries, in whatever darkness we happen to find ourselves living through. The sky went dark, the people were afraid, and then, slowly, imperfectly, in all the complicated and contradictory ways that human beings do everything, they found the light again. They always do.